I am your
Hello,
super
Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of Quincy Institute, is in the building, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Apologies for yesterday. We had to watch perhaps the most boring Wisconsin gubernatorial debate that's taking place, but we got a candidate in there, Francesca Hong. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's a wonderful DSA candidate. Running and actually killing it right now. She's got like 44%.
Wow.
It's freaking out the establishment a lot. But in any case, Trita, you're back, and the news are not so good. And I am very excited to have you. Thank you for coming on. Yeah, we got a real situation evolving. As of yesterday, Iran actually changed the pace of the theater by doing a non-retaliatory strike for the first time in the last 160 plus days by striking at U.S. assets in the Jordanian air bases, the U.S. air bases in Jordan. And Trump has since refused to retaliate, as a matter of fact. So very interesting predicament. I wanted to hear your assessment on where things are going and if you still feel confident that there is any opportunity for peace.
Look, there always is opportunity still for peace, I think. Although I agree with you fully, it is looking very, very bad. The trajectory has shifted dramatically. Let me start off by sharing just my thought and analysis as to why I think the Iranians did this. I think this really surprised the US. They did not expect this. And it was, from the US perspective, highly provocative to do it while Netanyahu and Zelensky are in Washington, D.C. It adds additional pressure onto Trump. So the fact that the US hasn't responded yet, and I'm not 100% sure if that is the case. There was some sort of attack earlier on, I heard. But either way, I don't find that very likely to be a lasting situation. So why did the Iranians then do this? There's been a lot of speculation that this is because they lost faith in diplomacy with the United States. They're trying to test to see how strong Trump's resolve is, all of these different things. And I think there are probably elements of truth in that. But the way I see it, I would limit it to essentially three key reasons. First one is oil prices have come down. Despite the fact that the strait is closed, even during this informal ceasefire, oil prices has come down, which then creates a problem for the Iranians because there was never a negotiated ceasefire. It's just that the US stopped fighting. The US has stopped bombing. And if it is so that the US can decide when there's a ceasefire and when there isn't one by simply bombing or not bombing, and the Iranians just have to follow suit, then that creates a scenario in which Trump will always have an option, a rather costless option, in which he can just go from diplomacy to fighting back to ceasefire, and the Iranians would just have to adjust to that. So an informal ceasefire is completely unacceptable to the Iranians, but particularly now when they saw that oil prices were coming down, it meant that the economic pressure on Trump was reducing much faster than the Iranians thought. I don't think this is the main reason. The second reason is, I think the Iranians wanted to showcase that they are willing to take preemptive actions against the United States because they believe the US was preparing an attack. They claim that there was intelligence and maneuvers in the US with new assets coming to the region that suggested that the US was in the direction of an attack. And by taking preemptive measures, they're trying to signal to the United States that if you think that there's like a massive escalatory step that you can take, a larger war, you hear Trump constantly say that, we're just going to go at Iran much harder than we did before. So if there is a belief that a bigger war is in your favor, the Iranians are trying to deter the US, and I know this may sound paradoxical, by showing their willingness to attack first. Now, of course, there's a huge risk with that at the end, and we'll talk about that. And the third thing, I think, is the combination of a couple of factors here, which really puts a fine print on this. I think the Iranians have come to the conclusion that Trump will never commit himself to diplomacy unless he no longer has a military option. And by showing their willingness to go to war with the US, by preemptively attack the US, they're trying to tell him, you don't have that option because you think that that option is going to be easy for you, but we're willing to fight you. And only when Trump has concluded that he doesn't have a military option will he start becoming sincere and genuine about diplomacy. So the pathway to a deal is not, or to peace, is not a deal. The pathway to it is to first eliminate the military option, force a realization that only diplomacy, meaning no combination of diplomacy and military action, will work. And then at that point, you can actually make a deal feasible, and you can make a deal.
So yeah, I agree with I agree with your assessment. What do you think this says about the American conversations that have been taking place in Western media, specifically about the quote unquote chaos within the Iranian governance structure? The New York Times Daily actually had this long report that I found to be coping, I guess, with the situation a little bit by claiming that there is a real disagreement between the hardliners and the more moderate, more pragmatic elements. The more pragmatic elements that are trying to still maintain a more positive posture towards a ceasefire negotiation, whereas the hardliners are maybe even acting out at times. There was talk about how the IRGC might have actually even decided on their own to strike the U.S. assets in the region or strike at the ships to abide by the MOU. I don't think that's correct, but does this change that calculation? Does it make it impossible to determine that there is any kind of inconsistency, any kind of chaos or conflict inside of the Iranian governance structure right now?
Look, I think we have very little insight into what's happening inside the Iranian government. But I do think that there seems to be some sort of a inclination to assume that because we don't understand it. And we're very quick to go to those type of explanations. And again, sometimes they're probably true, but it doesn't mean that there's some sort of inherent problem. I find it peculiar that we're so quick to come to that conclusion when there's such clear signs that there's massive chaos in the American government.
I was about to say, Iran didn't fire 12 generals, I don't think. Iran doesn't have leakers going to mainstream news and sidestepping the security meetings that they're having right now to basically advance the warning signs that we're running out of interceptors.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't have a situation there in which they have like an intelligence service that leaks that type of information that completely contradicts what the government is saying, etc. Now, some of that is normal, but we are in a truly chaotic situation these days with the manner that this current administration is running things. But I do think like there is a reality one has to recognize, and it shouldn't be surprising. This is why I think some of these reportings are a little bit odd. Why are you surprised that in a situation of war, it is the IRGC that has the upper hand? It is the generals that in a state of war actually tend to have the strongest voices, not the diplomats. Or the idea that, so for instance, there were negotiations about 2-3 weeks ago before you had a full collapse of the MOU. And it was in Muscat. The American side actually didn't really show up. So it was done by the Omanis and the Iranians. And the Iranian foreign minister essentially was negotiating a text, a joint statement by the Omanis. He seemed to have thought that he had the mandate for it. Went back to Tehran by phone and got it nixed. And, apparently he couldn't sell it to Tehran. And then the question is, well, how could they overrule the foreign minister? Of course they overruled the foreign minister. The foreign minister doesn't make these decisions at the end of the day. You had a similar situation in which Kushner and Witkoff were in Geneva, negotiated a deal with Iranians through the help of the Omanis back in February. And even told the Iranians that they are very confident that Trump is going to like this deal, went back and Trump said no, and instead started a war 24 hours later.
Perfidy.
No one said that, how is it possible that Witkoff could be overruled? Of course he can be overruled. He's not the president. And currently the situation in Iran is not that the foreign minister is running the foreign policy. It is the government as a whole, and within that government, clearly the IRGC and the military are having the upper hand because they're at war.
Yeah, the Supreme Leader Trump has the final say on these decisions, and perhaps there's someone even above him that is capable of changing his mind. And that man is Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's currently in Washington, D.C. I wanted to hear what your perspective is. Like, obviously, there is this real crisis. CSIS has reported that the standoff munition stockpile has diminished dramatically. The interceptor stockpiles have diminished dramatically, where the current assessment is that we do not have enough interceptors, PAC-3s, and THAAD missiles to potentially wage any war with our peer or near peer adversaries. I think it's worse than that. I suspect that it's actually not about a potential crisis in the future, but the real crisis that's taking place in the Gulf right now. I don't think we have enough to even go through a long and extended conflict with Iran. So now there's 2 points of pressure. The markets, obviously, being the first point of pressure, the energy markets, and the munitions. And it seems to me that is the real reason why Trump has not gone through an additional escalation and instead is demonstrating some semblance of restraint. Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is capable of convincing him otherwise, especially when reporting shows that he's frustrated with the Pickaxe Mountain targeting that obviously came from the Israeli side as another opportunity, a lifeline to continue striking Iran, to give Trump and the Western media another target that Trump could focus on?
Yeah, look, first of all, regarding the interceptors, it's precisely because of that, because these are not mysteries. I mean, these numbers in this, the audit of it was very clear from the outset. So the only way going back to war really could work was if it was a new plan with some new intelligence and some new ability, capacity, some new tactic strategy that would ensure a victory in very short order. Because if it was dragging out, then yes, this problem with the interceptors would very quickly rear its head. And this is part of the reason I'm so surprised as to why Trump really restarted this, because I expected that if he's actually going to restart this war, he must have a plan. He must have a new technology. He must have a new intel. And it appears that he had absolutely none of them. And instead, some haphazard bombings in the south of Iran eventually would have brought about some new situation, right? So it's still a mystery to me how this decision actually was made, because there's not even a semblance of some sort of a strategy or theory of change, theory of how this could succeed. So the interceptor problem has always been available. It's always been known. We saw it back in 2025, in which the Israelis started asking for a ceasefire after 9 days or 10 days of fighting because they were running low. 10 days. And that was when the US was providing a tremendous amount of support for them as well. So it's not a new problem in any way, shape, or form. Is it the reason why he's showing restraint? In many ways, I think it is. The question is, why wasn't that same factor present to make him decide not to do this in the first place?
Maybe it's because the military is less woke this time around, even less woke than before. Because pre-MOU, Pete Hegseth said they're going to start, being less woke. And maybe post-MOU, they're going to be even less woke than the past. Have you factored in the secret weapon?
Yeah, I think there is an argument to be made that the president was so frustrated for a variety of reasons that he was just, screw this diplomacy, I want to see a bombing campaign. And you didn't have people in the military or around him that were willing to say, look, understand your anger, but this is not going to work. That Trump was simply not receptive to that. And he wouldn't be until he had proven to himself that this won't work, which happened about 7 to 8 days into this war. Yeah. And as a result, now he's more susceptible to that article, which then comes to your other question, which is, can Netanyahu nevertheless shift it around? I think there is one thing that the Israelis likely tried yesterday, and I think Netanyahu hinted at it publicly by saying that they came in with some new ideas.
Oh, God.
And I think what this may suggest is that the US military itself is not coming up with any more ideas at this point, because none of them are good, and they know that this is not going to go anywhere. So they're not going to put bad options in front of Trump. But that means that there is a bit of a vacuum there when it comes to military ideas, and Trump has probably rejected a lot of them. And the Israelis may come up with another one of these spectacular ideas that look good on paper or look good in Trump's eyes, but have no relationship with reality just as much as their previous idea, which is starting this entire war in the first place, had a very, very bizarre relationship with reality.
As far as new ideas goes, I mean, the old idea is obviously the last remaining step on the escalation ladder from the American side, which is a ground invasion of the coastal islands and maybe even the Iranian coast. Now, of course, this is a spectacular failure that's imminent, a lot of military casualties. Trump's also very reluctant to go the full distance and actually put boots on the ground. He has consistently refused to do so in the past. Is there any chance that the administration tries to fight their way out of this, by your estimation, considering that it is kind of the last remaining option because we've been doing the same thing over and over again? It's very clear that an aerial bombardment campaign is not going to create regime change at all. And America's not even gaining sufficient leverage over Iran in the process. And every day that this continues, Iran is actually gaining additional leverage over the oil markets.
So I wouldn't even concede the idea that this is an option unless Trump, the people around him, and the military are willing to accept thousands of American casualties and killed, because that is what this would be. And they know that. They know that already back in the first round of this war, in which they looked at those options and ultimately decided not to do it. So again, if you were to do it, either it's because you're completely desperate or because you have some new strategy, some new intel, some new capability that changes the equation, because it has been looked upon numerous times and it doesn't look good in any way, shape, or form. Can you take an island? Yes. Can you keep it? Yes. What is the cost of that? Immense. What is the strategic utility of it? Very limited. Does it change the picture? No. You're just positioning yourself in a stationary way that allows the Iranians to rain missiles on you, and you cannot force protect. You can provide force protection for the troops under those circumstances in an effective manner. So it would be a lot of people killed for absolutely nothing. That was the reality in the first round. I don't see anything that suggests that that is not the reality today. If the belief is that this bombing of southern Iran has reduced Iran's ability to close the strait, remember, this is exactly what was tried with the Houthis in February of 2025.
Yeah.
When Waltz and others convinced Trump to do that. And after 9 weeks, he stopped, and I don't think he's even mentioned the word Yemen since then.
Yeah, no, he said famously, the Houthis got hands. Like, he literally said they're brave fighters. They're really tough fighters.
Exactly. And I spoke to folks at the Pentagon at the time who were saying that, they were stunned by how quickly the Houthis immediately dug up missiles, fixed the different silos or, entry points in which the missiles were. And the Iranians are doing exactly the same thing. And, at the end of the day, it's probably the Iranians that trained the Houthis on this. So if it didn't work against the Houthis that are far less dug in, far less resources, have not had this strategy for that long, whereas the Iranians have been preparing for this since the mid-1990s, I just don't buy for a second that this 13-day campaign has achieved more against the Iranians than what 9 weeks did against the Houthis.
What level of knowledge do we have over the Houthi ballistic munitions and drone procurement capabilities? Because from what I understand, they are still significantly reliant on trying to create an air bridge between Iran, and this is part of the puzzle for them. We don't know what. Do we even know what depth of stockpiles they have in terms of carrying out a continuous blockade over an extended period of time? Because I assume that their reluctance to enter the theater of conflict and close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait wasn't necessarily because they're a totally sovereign actor here, but more so because of the limitations that they acknowledge. But perhaps I'm wrong, and I wanted to know if you have additional information on that.
I don't have an answer to that. My suspicion would be, however, that first of all, they were made self-sufficient far earlier, meaning that they know how to build this stuff on their own now. In fact, I was told that they had even improved on some of the drones and were now reversing that, essentially the intelligence or technological flow was going from the Houthis to the Iranians.
Yeah, we saw that. Sorry to cut you off, but we saw that with the F-35. They were the ones who first used the loitering drones against the F-35 and almost successfully struck an F-35, which was shocking when it was revealed in the New York Times. I thought it was fake. So they definitely have improved. I just don't know how deep their facilities are, both literally deep as far as like bunkered down, but also like how many munitions they have.
Yeah. Again, and I don't have the answer to that, but I would just, my suspicion would be is that they were never in a position in which that had been depleted by the time the Saudi-Iranian normalization occurred. They have the technology, remember they're importing this stuff in small parts rather than as whole. And as a result, I think it would be rather safe to say that they certainly have the capacity to carry this on for some time. How long, I don't know. But I think we should also recognize that there seems to be a connection now in which any manner in which a conflict between Saudi and Yemen would become full blown would also then entail a conflict between the Iraqi militias in Iraq and Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which then also changes the equation somewhat.
And I think that we're there right now, right? I mean, that's what it seems to be happening currently, because on the other side, while America has not retaliated against Iran directly, there was a joint U.S.-Saudi strike that took place against Iraq, the Iraqi militias. What does that say about the theater of conflict expanding?
Well, I think this was most likely a warning to essentially suggest that if the Saudis go in that direction, it will not just be with the Houthis, it will also be with the Iraqi militias. And by the way, there were elements of that before as well, in which some of the attacks on Saudi Arabia actually came from the north, from Iraq rather than from Yemen itself. Are we fully there? No, we're not fully there. But I think we are inching there. I think they're showcasing their capability. And the Saudis and the US are showcasing what they're capable and willing to do in return. And we saw with that strike, I think there were about 20 people killed, including 5 IRGC. Officers in Iraq. So we're seeing a horizontal escalation that goes beyond what we saw in the previous round of this war. And some of the nightmare scenarios that were avoided, such as the Houthis coming in and closing the straits there, Bab el-Mandeb, is now, at least they've hinted at it very clearly. They've shot at ships. And I think there's a recognition that they have a capability, at least for a period of time, of doing so, which is a very, very dangerous situation. And then you also have a potential, and I wrote about this on Substack and our Responsible Statecraft, that you may also have the Ukrainians trying to open up a northern frontier, because they struck an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea, showcasing their ability to use long-range drones, because that was a long-range drone that struck that. And I think it took the Iranians by surprise as well. And in the worst scenario, in my view, it's not just them showcasing what they can do. It's not just them, hinting to the U.S. what it can help the U.S. with, if the U.S. is more helpful to Ukraine in Russia, against Russia, or that they're just trying to exact the cost on the Iranians for the support Iran has provided Russia. But rather that this may actually be something bigger, which is to merge the two battlefields, to make the two wars one. And by that, push the US into something even Biden resisted, which was to get into a direct confrontation with Russia.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's unbelievably stupid. And I think that it's a very risky maneuver, especially considering, and I want to hear your take on this, any extension of the Iranian conflict actually plays against Ukraine's immediate interests of self-defense. Zelensky has asked for 300 PAC-3 missiles earlier today, when it's very clear that we're, panic shipping. We've deferred a lot of these Patriot systems that were supposed to be shipped to other allies. We've deferred those transfers specifically so we can hurry them to the Gulf region. And even then, we're depleting those munitions. So there's no PAC-3s that are coming to Ukraine in this situation, which makes it a lot easier for Vladimir Putin to, especially as temperatures get colder, to strike with ease at a lot of these energy facilities and leave Ukraine and the civilian population of Ukraine without heat in the cold winter. So I don't understand why. I mean, I understand why he's doing it. It seems like he's trying to merge the conflict, as you said, and to make himself seem more valuable to Trump. And unfortunately, because Trump is stupid, he has to do stupid things to make himself seem more valuable to Trump as an asset against Iran. Do you see that theater expanding as well on the Ukrainian front, or do you think that this was, a first strike and that they're going to go back to diplomacy somehow with Iran?
So we've seen some diplomatic activity between Iran and the Ukrainians, which appear to have occurred immediately after Zelensky's meeting
Yeah.
with Trump at the White House, in which the Ukrainian foreign minister essentially called up the Iranian foreign minister, appeared to have done some sort of an apology or acknowledgement of error, which then was accepted by the Iranians. And this appears to have been a diffusion of the situation. That in and of itself does not mean that the Ukrainians may have completely given up on this idea. It's just that, they show cases, they're lowering temperature and maybe go up again at some point. Your argument is a very interesting one because I think it really reflects the risk. If the Ukrainians expand this, but don't get massive American support and involvement in its war against Russia, then this is absolutely a losing proposition. So it's a huge gamble, because then they're just overextending themselves at a point in which they can't afford to without getting the kind of return on investment that they're looking for. So it is a huge gamble. I can understand why the Ukrainians think that it's a gamble that potentially is worthwhile, because for the first time in a long time, I think Ukraine came to Washington not necessarily as someone asking for charity, but someone who was offering help. And that Trump may have been susceptible to that offer precisely because he's in such a self-inflicted predicament with Iran in which he has no good military options and doesn't seem to have the patience or the good diplomatic options. Again, I'm not saying that this will happen. Some people are telling me it's inevitable. I'm not saying that it's a valid direction to go down. On the contrary, I would think it's very stupid. But I'm trying to see it from the perspective of those who would argue in favor. What is the logic that they're trying to see? And I think there is one. I'll add one other logic from the Israeli standpoint as to why I think they would be quite favorable towards this. One, it would prolong the Iran war, which is the Israeli interest, and they made that very clear. Two, the Europeans are involved in Ukraine, but they're not directly involved in the Iran war in the same way. This would bring them into that arena as well. And third, and perhaps most importantly, if these two wars merge, then you have a scenario in which you can reframe this conflict altogether. And then defeating Iran does not become something you do to defend Israel. It's something you do to defend Ukraine. And in the US in particular, mindful of how Israel has plummeted, its standing has plummeted in Washington. And the degree to which Democrats are opposed to the Iran war, but they're still very supportive of the idea of supporting Ukraine, it can shake things up in a bit that the Israelis may think is a bit unpredictable, but it could not possibly be worse than the situation the Israelis are facing right now.
Do you feel like that's connected with the likes of Laura Loomer, a Hasbarist, an ultra-Zionist, going to Ukraine, flying out to Ukraine and having a change of heart as she interviews Zelensky? I read that as a deliberate effort to merge both of these conflicts exactly in the same way that you're mentioning, in an effort to basically also improve the Israeli position by latching on to a much more bipartisan war, which is the continuation of the Ukrainian conflict, the Ukrainian defenses, especially at a time when Zelensky has also gained more leverage over Russia with its successive strikes on critical oil and energy infrastructure, partially with additional NATO involvement. That's how I read it. Do you feel the same way? And also, what do you feel about the mainstream laundering of the reputation of someone as unstable and as insane as Laura Loomer?
Let me start off with the first question. It certainly looks plausible because it was quite fascinating. I don't claim to understand how Loomer thinks and how she operates. She apparently thinks that she knows that about me. I can assure you that she doesn't. But it doesn't. It certainly does.
We should be careful. She's tried to get us both deported. So
exactly. It certainly does appear that it would fit that logic. But again, I don't know the details of it, and I don't know exactly what is motivating her. So, but it is something that a lot of people have taken note of, that this sudden effort to, treat the two wars as if they're the same, as if, this rhetoric that we're fighting the same enemy, that is a very typical effort to try to expand the war in order to make it more winnable, particularly when you're stuck. I mean, it's no different from other problems. When faced with a problem, sometimes you have to make it bigger to resolve it. In this specific case, I don't think it does. I think it actually brings us closer to essentially a world war. It would end up being a scenario in which this war would take place on 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa, because of the Red Sea. I think that would be an absolute disaster. But that does not mean that others do. They may see it as an opportunity.
So there was one other question I wanted to ask you about the Iraqi strike capabilities, because obviously the Ansar Allah movement allegedly has also struck the Yanbu port, which is obviously playing a pivotal role since the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. They've demonstrated that they have the willingness and capabilities of also striking Saudi Aramco facilities. This hasn't actually translated to the oil markets at all. Like the crude prices have not, the crude prices continue going down for some weird reason, even though the refinery is very clearly on fire. So I wanted to ask you, like, what's going on with the markets by your estimation? And 2, the Iraqi militias potentially striking a ship directly in the Red Sea, nearing the Suez Canal. What does that say about a potential oil and energy crisis in Europe, which is still, getting a lot of its needs met through the Suez Canal?
So, look, we remember 2019, the Saudi Aramco fields were struck. The Saudis, of course, point the finger to Iran. It does seem to be quite likely that actually there were Iranian drones. The Iranians were behind it, but it was shot by Iraqi militias in Iraq. They were coming from the northwest. That capability is clearly there, and I think this is one of those options that if there is this type of a total war or full-scale war that Trump is toying with, his idea that it will be the thing that will work, reality is that the Iranians and their allies have counter-escalatory steps and measures at their disposal that would put the US and the entire global economy under tremendous amount of strain, far beyond what we have seen so far. And I have to say, when he comes to the oil markets, I am stunned. I am shocked. Already back in the first round of this war, the prices were artificially low. And of course, we know that a lot of that was because of the use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was because of oral interventions into the market that Trump kept on doing, playing with their expectations. But
China
now
also cutting down their imports by half almost. Yeah,
certainly, exactly. So there were a lot of different factors. How sustainable that is a different story. But my impression talking to folks there is that a lot of the folks in the market are just really relying on a degree of rationality, which I understand. I have to do the same thing when I do my analysis, but sometimes we just have to understand that rationality is not necessarily what is driving this. But they're just thinking there's no way you can continue doing this. And as a result, they have the expectation that oil is going to come down. And as a result, they're not panicking or actually even reacting to some of these things. And I think it may be a miscalculation, because I think we're closer to that type of an escalation than the market seems to think we are.
As far as going back to Ukraine, my assessment is that Ukraine actually gained tremendous leverage with the successive strikes on critical oil and gas infrastructure deep inside of Russian territory. They were able to successfully strike tankers as well, Russian oil shipments as well. Do you feel as though this also creates additional pressure on the volatility of the energy markets, which then, ironically enough, would make it harder for Trump to continue waging war against Iran? Because it feels like there's a direct contradiction with the things that Ukraine is doing that is allowing them to gain tremendous leverage over Russia. I think this is the highest point that Ukraine has been at since, and the battle lines have not shifted, obviously. But I'm saying, like, as far as universalizing the cost for the Russian population, making them more angry, long lines at gas stations, Russia cutting diesel exports out of the country. All of this is, on the one hand, giving less of a timeline for Donald Trump in Iran, but also giving Ukraine a lot of additional leverage. I have maintained the position that this would be a perfect opportunity to try to pressure Vladimir Putin into a real long-standing ceasefire, not one that Vladimir Putin was dangling over Ukraine leading up to the Anchorage summit, which was very clearly Russia trying to sever ties between the United States and Ukraine, and even successfully getting to sever some ties between Ukraine and the United States, only to continue the war and make maximalist demands. Do you feel like Ukraine could entertain a ceasefire at this point? And do you think that there's any appetite from Zelensky to entertain some kind of ceasefire at this point, given that they're also trying to expand the theater of conflict?
Yeah, so I know too little about the war. I haven't been able to follow that at all for the last 6 or so months because of this other war, to be able to give you a more informed opinion on that. But I can tell you that the messaging that I seem to be picking up here in Washington with Zelensky's visit, it certainly is not one of going back to the negotiating table and finding a ceasefire. It is to take advantage of the current position that Ukrainians have to really push for far more American support and a stronger commitment to the US, to Ukraine. And Trump has really changed his tune on Ukraine in a rather dramatic way just in the last couple of weeks. And whether that actually is also connected to hints or suspicions of what the Ukrainians can do for Trump in Iran is unclear at this point, but that may very well be part of the puzzle.
Okay. Well, Trita Parsi, thank you so much for coming on. You have any parting thoughts, some final words, and also where can people find you?
They can find me at the Quincy Institute, which is quincyinst.org, on Substack, which is tritaparsi.substack.com, and at Twitter at tparsi.
All right. Thank you, Trita, for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Always
really
a wonderful experience. Have a good one.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye.